A collection of ghost stories. Volume 1. A novel by Neil Wesson. Chapter 19. The Erroneous Judgement. This story was inspired by a wet day on Lindisfarne, somewhere I suggest you do not visit in the rain. The island of Lindisfarne on the Northumberland coast has over the years been the source of many stories regarding the supernatural. Its history is littered with tales of monks from the priory dying in unnatural circumstances, strange goings-on in the castle, and the loss of sailors from the small fleet of crab catchers being lost at sea. Nobby Harper sat in the dining room of the small bed and breakfast. In front of him sat a plate containing a full English breakfast. The fare was that plentiful that the bacon teetered on the edge of the plate, almost falling onto the white tablecloth. The smell of the cooked breakfast reminded him that he was on home turf. He had recently returned home from the Great War and had tried to forget the nightmarish events that he had experienced in the trenches of France. This trip, he hoped, would put a closure to that particular part of his life. "You here on holiday then?" asked the landlord of the B&B as he carried in a toast rack, filling the room with the smell of warm toast. "Sort of," Nobby replied. "I'm here to visit someone." He didn't want to be drawn into a conversation on why he was here. It was too much a personal matter. He wasn't sure why, but he had to see his old commanding officer's grave, make sure he was dead. As the landlord, a large wild-haired man, probably an ex-fisherman, Nobby thought, put the toast down on the table, he paused before returning to his vertical stance. His attention was drawn by the regimental badge on Nobby's tie. It was the emblem of the local regiment, the Lindisfarne Fusiliers. "You were in the Fusiliers, I see," said the landlord, looking down on the seated guest. "Yes, that was my regiment." "You knew Captain Armstrong then?" "Oh yes, he was my commanding officer." "You'll know all about how he was killed then?" "Not really, as far as I know. He was killed by a sniper, taken out while lighting a cigarette." "There was an official inquiry, you know," the landlord said in a stern voice. "We only heard whispers." "You don't know how it was in the trenches." "It was cold, wet. We were never told anything of what was happening in the outside world. People would leave to fetch supplies and we would never see them again, hit by a shell, whilst working their way back from the front." He paused for a moment before continuing. "It was the worst place on earth. If you avoided the bullets, chances were that you would go mad with the continuous firing of the guns. You can't imagine what it was like." Nobby stared into space as he remembered the terrible ordeals in heat trenches. The landlord felt a twinge of guilt at using such a sharp tone on the veteran. "It's just that Arthur was well liked here on the island." Rumor was that his wounds could not have been caused by any German sniper. He was shot 3 times in the stomach. The inquest found that the bullets taken out of him were from a British pistol. He came back a hero, but a dead hero is no good to anyone. Nobby slowly nodded his head in silent reflection. "That's why I'm here, to visit his grave." In the kitchen, the landlady was closing the lid on Nobby's packed lunch. She listened to the conversation between her husband and paying guest with some interest. She had known Arthur Armstrong since he was a babe in arms, and she had been hurt more than most on hearing of his death. She carried the tin box out into the dining room and carefully placed it next to the now half-empty breakfast plate. "You knew the late captain then?" "Yes, I was just telling your husband, I was his sergeant." "Oh, it was awful. There were rumors that he was giving the Germans secret information." "I have never heard anything so outrageous in my life. He was one of the finest young men you could ever meet." Tears began to swell in her eyes, and she found it difficult to talk. "He won't rest well in his grave, not until his murderer is brought to justice." Her husband placed a reassuring hand on her arm. She took a tissue out of the front pocket of her piney and held it up to her face. The soft white paper covered her mouth and the lower part of our nose. Many awful things happened in those dark days in the trenches. With his lunchbox safely packed in his rucksack, he set off on his bicycle down towards the seashore. The sun was shining, reflecting on the sea in between the small collection of fishing boats. The bicycle came to a halt. He looked around the natural harbor. A haze hung over the water, making him involuntarily narrow his eyes. Turning to his left, he could see his destination. At the end of the spit of land that reached out into the sea, high on the outcrop of rocks, sat the castle. It sent his thoughts back to his childhood, when he had read the novel Dracula. The castle he now looked at was just how he had imagined the castle in Bram Stoker's story. Dismounting his ride, he pushed the machine up the steep cobbled hill. The air was thin today, and he was quite breathless on reaching the top. Leaving his bicycle against one of the huts made from the upturned hull of an old boat, he made his way up yet another uphill path to the castle entrance. The interior of the castle was cool. A slight smell of damp met his nostrils as he entered the various rooms. Climbing a staircase, he noticed a doorway marked Upper Terrace. He opened the door and stepped into the sunlight. From that high vantage point, he could see most of the island. Following the line of the outcrop of land he had cycled along, he could clearly see the ruins of the priory, And beyond the huddled-together houses, then the church. The church was his next calling point. He took a deep breath of air and looked down at the small people walking both to and from the castle. One figure didn't walk either way, it just looked toward it. Nobby couldn't make out whether it was a man or woman, the heat haze blurred the image. A shiver ran down his spine. He heard the door which led back into the interior of the building close, and he knew someone else has joined him outside in the sunlight. He turned to see who the newcomer was, but no one was there. They must have changed their mind about coming outside, he thought. Turning to gaze again at the view of the island, he noticed that the figure who had stood watching the castle had now gone. His mind returned to the conversation from breakfast. He hadn't told his hosts all he knew of the late captain's death. He knew precisely what had happened that dark day in October 1918. Rumors were rife that secret information on such things as battle plans and troop movements were finding their way into enemy hands. The source of the leak had eluded the command for several months until purely by chance Nobby was talking to a private who served as the captain's secretary. The man in his mid-30s was attaching messages to the rings on pigeons' legs, then letting them fly away back to the general's way behind the front line. Private Chunky Reed stood in front of 2 baskets of birds. 3 messages were attached to the legs of the pigeons from the basket to his left, while the other 4 were attached to the legs of the pigeons from the right-hand basket. Nobby was somewhat curious to the choice of birds for the message carrying. The private's reply was somewhat unsatisfactory. Orders from the captain, sir. 3 messages to go by pigeons from basket A, and the other 4 from basket B. To Nobby the mystery deepened as the birds were released into the dusk sky. 3 of the birds headed back toward headquarters, while 4 of the birds headed into no man's land. What was in those messages, Private? Demanded Sergeant Harper. No idea, sir. I am under oath not to read them. Nobby had had an awful thought. Could it be? No, surely not. The bicycle freewheeled down the hill away from the castle. The hill was so steep that he didn't have to start to pedal until he had nearly reached the town. The events of that dark day filled his mind. He rode the bicycle up the hill toward the church. He could see the tops of the gravestones over the dry stone wall which marked the perimeter. He leant his right up against the wall. He decided that, before he would do what he came here to do, he would sit on the wooded bench and have his lunch. As he ate the excellent cheese and pickles sandwich that the landlady had prepared for him, he had the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Was he imagining it, or had the temperature dropped suddenly? The sun was still shining, and it should have been the warmest part of the day, but Had could feel a definite chill coming on. Out of the corner of his eye he saw something familiar. It was the figure he had seen earlier, that morning looking up at the castle. Now he, for it was defiantly a man, was looking at the church. Nobby couldn't make out the features of the onlooker. He seemed to be wearing some kind of hood which masked his face. His lunch finished, Nobby slowly walked through the lit gate and started to read the epitaphs on the gravestones. He was looking for just the one name. A sense of nervous apprehension came over him as the dates became more contemporary. Finally there it was. Captain Arthur Armstrong, we trust the soul of our fallen brother to God's love. Read the epitaph. Nobby thought of the man who lay there, and thought of how he met his end. Sergeant Nobby Harper silently walked into the captain's quarters. The room was a mere hole in the earth off the main trench, but it offered some amount of comfort. The captain had a bed, a desk and a bowl for washing and shaving, much more than the average soldier. The captain sat at his desk reading a newspaper when he realized that someone had entered the room. Slowly he looked up at the figure of his sergeant standing 6 feet in front of him. It is customary to knock before entering, Sergeant, the captain said, frowning at his officer. Harper remained silent. Well, the superior officer asked, a note of impatience in his voice. I have found the information leak, sir. Harper's voice was matter-of-fact tone. Well done, Harper. Who is it? The captain sat up in his chair and threw the newspaper down on the desk. Don't you know, sir? Had Harper gone mad? Of course he didn't know. If he had have known, then the culprit would have been dealt with already. Pigeons, sir, pigeons. Harper has not moved a muscle since his arrival. He appeared to be frozen to the spot. It's all to do with pigeons. Pigeons? Someone has homing pigeons that fly to the German side of no man's land, sir. Excellent work. Who is it? They look identical to yours, you see, sir. They just fly in a different direction. Who is it, man? Shouted the captain, now at the end of his fuse. Harper unclipped the press stud on his leather sidearm holster and took out his pistol. It came to rest by his thigh. It's you, sir. What? Armstrong couldn't believe his ears. What makes you think that, Sergeant? They're your pigeons, sir. Harper showed no emotion as he pointed the gun at Captain Armstrong. This is outrageous. How dare you raise a weapon at me? I'll have you court-martialed for this. Armstrong had gone red in the face with rage. I don't think so, sir. Come on then, let's get it over with. I am obviously under arrest. "Are you going to take me into custody?" The captain said these words in a mocking tone, a dangerous thing to do considering the mental state of his sergeant. "No point, sir. You are too well connected in high command. I am not here as your jailer, I'm here as your executioner." "What? You'll hang?" "I don't think so, sir." Armstrong made a lung for his gun belt, which hung on a hook nailed into one of the roof supports. Harper emptied 3 bullets into the captain's torso. His body fell back against the wall. As he slid down, he took a towel which had been hanging on a nail with him. As his lifeless body hit the floor, the towel sank onto his head, obscuring the top half of his face. As silently as he had entered, Nobby left the captain's quarters. He had to do it, he had to. He told himself as he looked down at Captain Arthur Armstrong's headstone. Why had such a good man gone over to the enemy? There was that strange figure again. Standing on the other side of the graveyard, he hadn't seen him pass. How had he got in? A thought ran through his mind. He took in a sharp breath and shivered. What had he been thinking? He must have been out of his mind. It was the guns, the constant sound of the firing guns. They had warped his mind. He can't have been think straight. The captain wasn't sending messages to the enemy. It was his secretary, Chunky Reed. He was the one. Oh no, what had he done? His breathing suddenly increased. His heart thumped louder and louder in his chest. Slowly he looked up at the figure watching him. The figure had not been looking at the castle or the church. It was him. He was the one being watched. Slowly the figure lifted its head for the first time. Under the cowl was the white, drawn face of Captain Arthur Armstrong, his 2 eyes black and bulging out of their sockets. In sheer abject fear, Nobby turned and ran. Outside of the churchyard wall, he wrestled with his bicycle before finally mounting it and pedaling off down the road as quickly as he possibly could. He turned his head back toward the graveyard. The figure was gone. Turning to view the road once more, his heart skipped a beat as he saw the ghostly specter no more than 10 feet in front of him. He swerved to avoid it. Faster and faster he paddled the machine. Again he turned back. Nothing. Nobby rode down the hill. Head down he went, faster and faster. He looked up. There directly in front of him was the phantom, laughing. Nobby took his hands off of the handlebars and shielded his eyes with his forearms. A collision was now unavoidable. The bicycle continued on and suddenly slowed, then tipped over as it hit the fast-moving current as the sea passed over the causeway, the only way off of the island. The bicycle and rider were swept away in the unforgiving waters. Nobby dragged himself onto the shore. He was not sure what had happened to him in the last 3 hours. His bag remained at the B&B. He never returned to the island to retrieve it. He never returned to Holy Island again. On one occasion he stood on the Northumberland shoreline and looked across the small stretch of water that separated the island from the mainland. He couldn't be certain, but he was sure he could see a dark figure looking back at him. He walked along the coast to the car park that marks the start of the causeway but never crossed. The end.